Okay, so let's kind of just recap last week. I mentioned that chapter 3, it's a lot about teaching. It's a lot about the tongue, but I think if you had to put a banner over it, self-control, self-discipline, Christian maturity seems to be the point of chapter 3, and really just what he's been building at since chapter 1. And so, one of the things, we talked last week about how, especially you see this in the world, undisciplined people, right? You see this in the world, where there's no spiritual discipline, no self-control. What that looks like, how that ends up coming out in people's life. You see it in their work habits. You see it in their personal lives. It's where people just they skip steps. They're trying to reach the end without putting in the appropriate work. They're trying to achieve a goal without, putting in the labor to get there. They're cutting corners, those sorts of things. And you see those things with children, and so you're trying, if you've got families, you're trying to work through those things with your kids. You're trying to get them to go back and say, no, we didn't quite finish the job yet. You need to go back and put in the work and do this right. But you see it with adults too. So it's a worldly, it's an immature attitude. And so faith without works is how that looks in the church. Right? Faith without works is, hey, I can parrot the words, I can say the language, I can sound religious, but I'm not putting in the effort on my part to actually make this practical and try to live it. I'll come to church on Sunday morning, I got the Bible under the arm, I'll sit there and sing the songs, I'll shake the preacher's hand. I can do the easy part, but I'm not taking it home with you. So faith without works is a lazy approach to this, right? It's cutting corners, that sort of a thing. That same lack of self-control, right, and self-discipline we see in the desire of some people who want to teach but do not desire to put in the work to be a fit teacher, right? And so that was kind of what we got into last week. And so James was warning us last week about teaching and about making sure that we take teaching seriously. And then we get into some issues of the tongues last week. And so he gave us 4 illustrations that showed the power of the tongue to direct the direction of the person, right? And that's really what he's trying to show, that not just that the tongue is this uncontrollable thing that's out doing its own thing, but actually it is leading the person. It can corrupt the person, it defiles a person, it can set a course of life for the person, because what is coming out of the mouth, okay, and again, we've hit this a lot, we're going to hit it again tonight, where does it start from? Yeah, it's starting in the heart. So that's, the mouth is just revealing that. Just like your works is going to reveal your faith, right? Same sort of idea. And so James told us if we can bridle the tongue, you can bridle the whole body. And so again, there's a lesson there about our whole life and what the tongue is revealing about the condition of our life. And so he brings up these illustrations. We've got a bit in a horse's mouth. We've got a rudder on a ship. A spark that begins a forest fire, and then 7 and 8 we haven't got to yet. It's about taming animals. And so, but in the first 3 of those examples, you see something very small able to control the direction of something very large. And so, as far as we're concerned, the tongue's not, it's a pretty minor part of us, but it seems to be the thing that directs the rest of the body. And so, just to kind of get us back there, verse 3, if we put the bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we'll direct their entire body as well, right? And so the bit in the mouth, okay, the principle there was that it doesn't just control the horse's mouth. That's, the reason you put a bit in the horse's mouth isn't because you need to control its mouth. You're controlling the horse, through the mouth, right? That's the idea. So again, this connection that he's trying to make, that the tongue has control over the body, right? So there's something to say about our speech and our direction. Now we talked about that. We kind of ran some side studies and discussions last week, but we brought up how this works with 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And we mentioned that there is a shortcut to those things. Right, if we want to cut corners, there's a big difference between giving thanks and what we normally do is just be thankful. Right? Well, the command isn't be thankful, it's express it. It has to come out of your mouth, right? And the same thing with rejoicing. Like the command is not just try to be joyful, but you have to express it. right? Rejoice always. In everything give thanks, right? Pray without ceasing. So these are things that come out of our mouths. And so anyway, the point is the Bible has a lot to say about the things that come out of our mouth, but what comes out of our mouth affects our attitude, it affects our mood, it affects how we interact with each other. You find someone that's always complaining, they're miserable, okay? They're always miserable, right? And so the things that come out of our mouth absolutely affect us because they're revealing our heart, okay? All right, and then he brings up the ship. So he says, look at the ship also, though they're so great and driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. Again, we're still recapping last week. I just want to make sure we get the whole context. And so in this analogy, the thing I wanted to bring up was the fact that there are two forces that are pushing on the ship, right? And so there is the wind, right? But then there's also the rudder. And so the point was, without intervention, a large ship is driven around by the wind. And so there's a lot of scripture that talks about, as Christians, we need to grow up and not be driven around by the wind, right? We need to be able to make sure that we can stay the course in the midst of the current. And so anyway, without the intervention of the pilot, the ship's driven by the wind, but using the rudder, the pilot can direct the ship and overpower the influence of the wind and the storm around them, right? And so the question then becomes for us, in our life, who's the pilot? Okay? Who's directing the rudder, right? That turns the ship and overcomes the influence of the wind. And so it ought to be the Lord. That's the point. The Lord needs to be the one directing the ship. And then we talked about in chapter 3, verse 5, the fire. He says, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And so I brought up like the Great Chicago Fire was a good example. We talked about some of the numbers. What was it? 2/3 of the city burned to the ground. The homes that were lost, the people that were lost, and it started from what? I think it was a cow kicked over a lantern. But yeah, Jake's like a horse knocked over a bucket of water and started the Great Flood of Milton. So that's what happened. So, so small spark, big fire, right? And so the point was, the tongue is got great potential, good and bad. It can go either way. And so, if it's not controlled, it can become a great forest fire, lots of damage. And we talked about that. If you've been in a church where there's gossip, where there's slander, where, those sorts of things, it's a cancer. It just eats that place apart, and it doesn't take much, And so, but used properly, the same tongue can do a lot of good. We can share the gospel. We can build one another up. We can encourage, those sorts of things. So a lot of potential. All right, 7 and 8. So that gets us caught up. So this is where we left off last week. Verses 7 and 8. He says, for every species of beast and birds, reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. All right. Question worth thinking about, just if you keep in context everything that we've been talking about. The question becomes, is the tongue difficult to tame because it's so destructive? Or is the tongue so destructive because it's so difficult to tame? You see where we're going with that? And so something worth thinking about there. James says, he puts it this way, that every animal, right, every species of beast, bird, reptile, creatures of the sea, mankind has tamed and controlled them things. Okay, and what that means, like to tame something, that doesn't mean, well, now it's docile. It means to make something useful. Right? So typically, I know we don't, I grew up on a cattle farm, beef farm in southern Ohio. Animals had a purpose. You know what I mean? Like we didn't really have like cute little, like we didn't have a doodle around. You know what I mean? Everybody's got doodles now. Those things, yeah, that was personal. Doodles are useless. I'm sure they're cute and cuddly, but they serve no function. All our animals had a function, okay? If you can punt the dog over a fence, it's not a dog. I'm sorry, you've got a cat. You know what I mean? But on, where I grew up, animals had a function. And so you tame an animal because you're going to use it. Like it needs to be profitable. It has to, it's a guard dog, or it's pulling something, or, you know what I mean? Or you're going to eat it at least, you know what I mean? So, But that's why you tame an animal typically, is because it's going to serve a function. It's going to be profitable. It's going to be useful. And so when he says, look, we've tamed every kind of animal on earth, the point is we take something that's wild and we've brought it to a place where it can be used, right? It can be used to serve a function. And so the idea is that even wild animals have been controlled and found useful, and yet he describes the tongue as a restless evil full of deadly poison. He says, who can no one can tame it. And so let's talk about that word restless. Well, that's it. That's the word. Okay, but it means unstable, chaotic, disorderly, and inconsistent. And it paints this picture of the animal. Like if we think about a tamed animal, you think about a horse in a stall, maybe, or a domesticated doodle, okay, or whatever it is. It's calm, it's stable, it's docile, whatever. But if you take an animal that is not tame and you cage it, all it's doing is it's nervous, it's uneasy, it's unsteady, and it's the second it gets a slightest opportunity to break free, it's out of there, man. Like that's how those things work. And so that's how the tongue is. When he says it's a restless evil, the tongue, it's like if it's not been tamed, it's just waiting for an opportunity to break free, right? It's going to go out and be feral. It's gonna do its thing, right? It's going to speak the way the world speaks. And so, guys, this is what happens. We've talked a bit about this last week. What people try to do, and we're going to take a practical approach to this, is sometimes people, and I know when someone becomes a Christian, they're new at this. There's still, we've got part of that old man, and those old habits we got to get rid of, you know what I mean? And so we kill the old man, but you got to kind of keep the bat with you so you can knock it over its head every now and then and keep it down, And so there's some struggle there when someone is fresh and becoming a new Christian, like their transition out of the world, you know what I mean? There's some of those things are still out there a little bit. And so, it's what people tend to do, is they're like, well, I'll just have to watch my language. You know what I mean? This is how I'm used to talking, this is how I talk at work with the guys at work. And so I'll watch my language. That's like taking an animal that's not been tamed and trying to throw it in the cage. It's a restless, it's just waiting for an opportunity to break free. It's going to revert back to what it's used to doing. And so that's what ends up happening when people just try to, well, I'll just watch what I'm saying. And so when he says, okay, no one can tame the tongue, okay, does this give us an excuse for an unruly mouth? Well, of course not, right? This doesn't mean that it's okay to slander and to use foul language and those sorts of things. And obviously, this is like that idea, right? And I've heard that used. I've heard people bring this up. Well, no one can tame the tongue. Like that's, if that's the point, then it's in conflict with everything else that James is saying, right? And so, I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't mean what it says. I'm saying we need to look at this the right way. When he says no one, really what he's saying is it's the same man that can tame an animal cannot tame his own tongue. The King James says the tongue can no man tame, right? And so the implication is that the tongue cannot be tamed. It's not that it can't be tamed, only that you can't do it, right? That's the point, right? And so you can't do it. It's certainly not on your own. Only by the power of God can we get this thing in check. Okay, that's the point. And so, we got to reconcile verse 8 with chapter 1, verse 26. He says in verse 8, no one can tame the tongue. But in verse 26, if anyone thinks to himself to be religious and does not bridle his tongue, deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. And so, to get practical with this, you can't focus on taming your tongue, because if your heart is still corrupt and impure and worldly, anything you try with, it's not a tongue issue, is my point, right? I mean, if your focus is, I got to watch my language, I got to watch my mouth, I got to make sure I don't say this or say that, you're going to fail because you're not addressing the problem, right? And so you can't tame the tongue. You bridle the tongue by working on the heart. That is the principle here. That is the point, right? And so, so the same man that can tame animals, he can't just tame the tongue. You have to start with a new heart. That's the point. And so what ends up happening is, okay, like I said, maybe you come in and you're saying, okay, I'm at church now, and I talk this way at work, and I talk this way around my family and my friends, but now I'm in the church building, and so I got to watch what I say. I can't say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend anybody. Don't want to expose myself as a hypocrite. Well, you can keep that up for a little bit, but the more involved you get with the church body, like we ought to be, the harder it's going to be to fake that, for one. But then all it's going to take is, you trip, you fall, you slam your hand in something happens, and you're not going to be able to filter the reaction that comes out of your mouth. So if it's in here, it's coming out of here at some point. Your mouth will betray your heart. It will expose your heart for what it is. And so that's why you can't watch your language. You have to watch over your heart. That's the point. Okay, when you react, what's in your heart will come out of your mouth. And so the only solution to bridle the tongue and to tame the tongue is to do it with a changed heart. Okay, and apparently I'm missing a slide here somewhere. Nope, I got behind myself. Okay, let's look at some scripture. Matthew 12:34. You brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak what's good? The mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. Right? So again, the issue with the mouth is it's only going to express what's already in the heart. Okay? Matthew 15, same idea, 18 through 20. The things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. These are the things which defile the man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile the man. And this is worth thinking about for a while, guys. He says out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. You can take a list like that. Okay, and you're going to find people struggling with these sorts of things. And someone may say, man, I've just got these bad thoughts in my head. I got to get these thoughts out of my head. Well, if your focus is on the thoughts, you're never going to get there. Right? Because the only way to change the thoughts in your head is to change what? Change the heart. Right? If someone's going to sit there and say, yeah, but you know what? I've got problem with hatred. Maybe not out murdering everybody, but I've got hate. And you can't focus on the hate. You have to focus on your heart. And the same thing with lust, and the same thing with stealing or lying or slandering. Those aren't the issues. Right? The issue is the heart. Right? That's what has to be addressed in all those situations. And that's what Jesus is talking about. He made the same statement, in chapter 21. He goes through and, gives the woe to the Pharisees, and over again, condemns them for trying to appear one way on the outside, even though inwardly there is no change. And he tells them, they're whitewashed tombs, so they're just full of dead inside. That's all that's in there. And he tells them to clean the inside of the cup. Right? That's the idea. And so we have to focus on the inside. And then he says the outside will become clean too. And so that's the idea is, for our lives and for people we're trying to help, it's important to not focus on the limbs, but to focus at the root, right? That's the problem is in the heart, right? We have to change the heart. And so the Lord is going to direct us on how to do those things. And then, so anyway, these are the things that defile the man. That's the idea. And so out of the heart, your mouth will expose your heart. So if you have a language problem, you don't have a language problem, you have a heart problem. That's what needs to be addressed. And so the only way to bridle the tongue is to do so with a changed heart. And so that's why you can't tame the tongue. You have to focus on the heart. Focusing on the tongue will never accomplish it. But that's why James is talking about this. Guys, if we go all the way back to the beginning of this, it's the emphasis isn't the works. What creates the works? Proper faith. The problem is people try to fake the faith, and it becomes evident when the works aren't there, right? And so same thing here, if your language is not consistent with your faith, right? Well, that's the evidence that you're trying to fake it. You see what I mean? And so if your heart's in the right place, the language will correspond with that. Okay? And so we've got to focus on the heart, not focus on the language. It's the same thing. And so, again, any attempt to address the mouth, the problem at the mouth, is going to be in vain. And like I said, he's been working through that, this whole time. He's talking about being consistent, not being unstable, in your life. He's addressing an empty religion that, well, I hear it, but I don't do it. You know what I mean? I've got faith, but I can't prove that to you. I can't show you that because it doesn't produce anything in my life. We've got people wanting to teach, but their life is not consistent with the doctrine they're trying to teach. And so those are all issues he's dealing with. Okay, moving on to verse 9. He says, with the tongue, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who've been made in the likeness of God. Okay? And so, he's showing how inconsistent our mouths are. And one of the reasons he's doing this is he's not just showing us the inconsistency of it, he's trying to show us how absurd it is. Right? He's bringing up the fact that there's nowhere in the world that you can see this kind of inconsistency in nature. Only man has devised something like this, where we can, try to pretend to be something that we're not and try to fake that, and out of the same mouth can come, all these sort of different sort of things. And so he's like, with the same mouth, you've got a guy who can stand here and bless the Lord, and then he's going to turn around and curse men. And so, that's the problem. And so the tongue, again, will reveal the nature of the heart it belongs to, and an unclean heart is going to have a very inconsistent tongue. Very inconsistent tongue. Okay, and so, anyway, he brings us back to creation, okay? Genesis 1:26, of course, it says that, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And in chapter 9, after they get out of the ark, okay, and, after the flood, we're now allowed to kill animals and eat and all of that sort of thing. But God puts a prohibition here on killing man. He says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for the same reason, right? For he is made in the image of God, right? That's the idea. And so we're prohibited from killing men because they're made in the likeness of God. James says we're prohibited from cursing men for the same reason. Okay, and so Romans 12:14, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. And so the idea of cursing men, okay, as this goes back to, guys, it's not about what's coming out of the mouth necessarily. Again, it's about where the heart's at in this situation. The word curse is interesting. It comes from two words, kata being down and aromai, which is to curse, but there's a position involved. That's what I want you guys to see with this word. It's not just what's coming out of the mouth. There's a condition or a position that the individual is in order to do this. Okay, and so the point is to curse someone is to regard yourself as occupying a higher position than the one you're cursing. That's the down, right? So there's this direction to it. And so the individual that can do this, right, that he's talking about, feels like they're in the position where I can look up to God and bless God, but I can look down to man and curse man, right? It's a very strange thing, but we spent a lot of time in chapter 2 talking about, showing partiality, and we've talked a lot about being humble versus being arrogant, and elevating yourself above others and those sorts of things. And so essentially to curse man, someone is in a position where they're asking God to intervene in a destructive nature toward man whom God's created in his own image. But there's also this issue that he's in a position where he thinks he is higher up than that person. I'm in a better place than that person. I'm in this place where, again, I can look up to God, but I'm looking down to man. And so that's not a position we want to be in. So, again, there's a heart issue in that word curse. Verse 10, from the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Okay, and so, again, James is addressing the Christian when he says these things ought not to be this way. Quickest tell, guys, if I'm dealing with a real Christian or not is what's coming out of their mouth. When I meet somebody, and they start talking like the world, I can pretty much figure they're not a Christian. What's interesting is when they find out that I am, there's a lot of people that, oh, my bad, and then they start, I was on a plane. Where was I going? I don't remember where I was going. I got on a plane and it was packed. It was loaded down. And, I'm such a tiny, petite guy. Everyone wants to sit by me on an airplane. And anyway, so I'm in this plane, and there's 3 seats, and there's me and a guy that's built just like me, and then a real tiny guy. So, they put me and the big guy together and the tiny guy on the outside. We ended up kind of switching. But but it worked out. But anyway, the guy that I first sat down with, he immediately starts in on, hey, where are you from? I told him where I was from. He's telling me about the Costco that we got in Florence. I'm like, I'm aware of the Costco we got in Florence. He likes that one better than the one where he's at, because he was from Ohio, because the one in Florence, I guess, is a big liquor store. I guess that's kind of unique. And so he really likes the liquor store and all of this sort of stuff. And the whole time he's talking about, getting drunk and, and the parties he's throwing, and he's cussing and carrying on. So what do you do for a living? And so I told him, and he's like, oh, so, okay. And then he starts talking to me about the Creation Museum and the Ark and, and all the good work he does. And he quit cussing and never heard anything more about the partying and the drinking, and so it's interesting, how quick he switched. And the point is, James is saying for a Christian, it shouldn't be like that at all. Like, you should be what you are, regardless of who you're talking to. The script shouldn't change whether you're talking to someone in the world or talking to someone in the Christian. But the thing is, we kind of expect that from the world. Like, worldly people do behave that way. They will change. They'll become chameleons. They'll become whatever it is you think the people in front of them want you to be, that sort of thing. Even worldly people that aren't interested in the church will, if you guys, they'll apologize to you for the language that they're using because they recognize it may be offensive, things like that. And so, but when James says things ought not to be this way, he's talking about the church. It shouldn't be that way for the church. We know it's like that for the rest of the world. That's why, we expect that. I mean, I expect that. I expect when I'm talking to someone who's not a Christian that their language isn't going to be great. That they're going to use words that they shouldn't be using and all that sort of a thing. And but when I'm talking to a Christian, I have a different expectation out of them. And that's all that James is bringing up. Out of the mouth of the world, yeah, we're going to get all sorts of inconsistencies. Sometimes it's just cursing, but you're going to get this inconsistent thing out of people in the world. But for Christians, it ought to be the same. Whether you're in the church building, whether you're at home, whether you're at work, whether you're talking to someone that just messed up, or the waitress that got your order wrong, or the bank teller that got the money, doesn't matter. Your speech should be consistent and in line with the faith that you profess to have. And so there's something wrong with a life that is supposed to be dedicated to God, and yet the mouth is overflowing with words that are inconsistent with the faith that they claim to hold, right? And so these things ought not to be this way. In the Greek, and I didn't throw it up there because it's translated right. It's a very strong language. And it does indicate that these things ought not to be this way, but it's also, James is inferring that they are this way right now, and it needs to stop. Right? And so that's the idea. These things need to stop being this way, is kind of one way you could look at that. And so, and the other thing is, it doesn't make sense, right? I'm not just a Christian on Sunday morning. I'm not just a Christian on Tuesday night or Wednesday night. Like, I'm a Christian before God 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, prostrated spiritually before Him. He's my Lord. He's my Savior. I mean, that's the Christian life. And so, it should be consistent everywhere, anywhere, every moment. So, verse 11, does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? So, James is further illustrating this idea that these things ought not to be like, you don't see this anywhere, right? It goes against what one would expect. It goes against common sense. And so the readers that James is writing to, they would have been familiar and understood the illustration. In a land where, rainfall is sparse, wells are few, they depended on springs for water. And so a lot of blessings come out of finding a good source of clean water. And so the word fresh that's used there, it's glucose. I think it's glucose. It's glucose maybe. Anyway, often it's translated sweet. It doesn't mean that it's actually sweet water. It's just, it's not bitter, right? It's not salty. It's fresh, right? It's unbitter. Is that unbitter? That's a word. Close enough. Yeah. Maybe we should go with sweet. But it's not like it's like Kool-Aid. Okay, coming out of the, yeah. So, but that's the idea. That's the word fresh. Bitter means sharp or bitter. It also can mean to cut or to prick. And so you could imagine The other day, I took a bite of some salsa that I think had been fermenting. And the second it hit my tongue, I was like, ugh, it cut. You know what I mean? Like that's the sensation. It was like, ugh. And so, that's the word bitter. It's like that's the sensation when it hits your mouth. It cuts, it pricks, it's sharp. That's the idea. And so this would be water that is brackish, sulfurous, or it contains salt. That's the idea. And so what James is saying, okay, the same opening in the earth, right, does a fountain. The word fountain can just mean opening. So from the same opening in the earth, it can't produce two different kinds of water. It's not possible, right? It just doesn't work that way. And so you can't have water that's both fresh and also bitter. You can't have water that's sweet but also brackish or salty. It doesn't work, right? Of course, what happens if you mix fresh water and salt water? It just all gets nasty, okay? You've ruined both of them, okay? So that's the idea. Now, verse 12, same idea. Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. So, continuing in the inconsistencies. It is impossible for a fig tree to bear olives, okay? For multiple reasons. Olives, are grown on a vine, and the fig trees are like, there's a lot wrong with that analogy. But they understand this. They know this, and we know this. From the beginning, it's been this way. There's a tree will produce a fruit. The fruit will have a seed in it, right? The seed will hit the ground and it'll sprout and it'll produce a tree of the same kind that produces fruit of the same kind that it originated at. And so it's been since God said so and set those things in order in the beginning. Okay, and so Jesus taught the same idea in Matthew 7, right? He says, you'll know them by their fruits. So, if you remember when we started this class, we said there's a lot of consistencies between the Sermon on the Mount and what James is teaching here. And so here's another one. You'll know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles are they. So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. And a good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruits cut down, thrown into the fire, so then you'll know them by their fruits. Now, he's not giving them advice on how to handle trees. He's talking about things everyone already understands, right? And he's relating this spiritually to the Christian. Now, I don't know, we've got a guy at church that thinks that everybody that walks the earth should be able to identify every tree that exists, even in the fall when there's no leaf on it, just by looking at the bark. Anybody here able to do that? I am not that guy, okay? He's like, what's that tree? I'm like, I don't know. There's no leaf. I don't know. Yeah, so it's, firewood. Yeah, firewood tree. And even when the leaf's on it, I'm still no better. I'm like, looks like it's a red leaf tree. It's that one's green. So, but here's the thing. If there's fruit on it, you're going to have a hard time getting one by me, okay? I mean, if there's an apple on that tree, I know it ain't a pear tree. You know what I mean? It's not a watermelon vine. It's not growing pumpkin. Like it's an apple tree. I may not know what kind of apple tree, but I can tell you it's an apple tree. And that's the idea. You can identify the tree by the fruit that it produces. And if it doesn't produce any fruit, and it's supposed to, it's a bad tree, right? And so it's wasting space is what it's doing. And so here's the premise: is what grows on the tree determines the kind of tree that it is, but also the kind of tree that it is determines what's growing on it. So these two things go back and forth. If you're a good tree, you'll produce appropriate fruit. If somebody's producing appropriate fruit, it's a pretty good indicator that that's a good tree, right? And so that's what you're looking for there. These things can't be out of sync. Can't be. Not in nature. That doesn't work that way. Okay, that's inconsistent. Every tree bears fruit according to its kind. What comes out of your mouth is an indicator of what kind of person you are. Period. Like there's no way around that. That is just the truth. Again, Matthew 12, 33 through 37, Jesus says this: either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak what's good? For the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. The good man brings out of his good treasure what is good. The evil man brings out of his treasure what is evil. I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they will give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you'll be justified, by your words you will be condemned. Got to get to the root of the problem here, right? That's all that James is trying to get at. A tree is known by its fruit, okay? Now, thing is, the fruit ain't the problem, right? The language ain't the problem, right? It's an indicator of a bigger problem, a deeper problem. And so, what does Jesus tell us to do? Make the tree good. Like that's, right? So if you're looking at your life and you're thinking, boy, my mouth is inconsistent with my faith, okay, don't focus on the language, focus on your heart, right? Make the tree better, right? The tree's the issue, right? So Jesus says either make the tree good or make the tree bad. But if you make the tree good, the fruit will be good. So the focus can't be on the works. The focus can't be on the language. The focus has to be on what is producing that in your life and getting that sorted out. Right? And so that takes a little bit of effort and some work, and you got to be honest with yourself and got to have some integrity, and you've got to get into the Word of God, and some accountability goes a long way with that. The people you surround yourself with, the things that you give attention to and priority to in your life. He mentions that the treasure has something to do with it. Well, what's valuable to you? What is important in your life? Where do you put the priority? He says that, good man brings out of his good treasure what's good, right? So there is a source to these things. Okay, your heart and your mouth, they're not going to be inconsistent, okay? The mouth's going to reveal what's inside. And so the conclusion is the right source produces the right water. The right tree produces the right fruit. And if you find your tongue producing the wrong kind of talk, then change the fountain of your conversations, right? Work on the roots of the tree. Out of the good treasure, right, the good man brings out what is good. So in order to bring forth fresh water and good fruit, we have to have a good, clean, pure source. So make the tree good, make the fruit good, right? Okay, moving on here. He says, so nor can salt water produce fresh. Salt water, that's true. Salt water can't produce fresh water, but, it's weird in the Greek because salt water doesn't really produce anything. He's going back to the source of the fountain, right? The same, a freshwater fountain can't produce salt water. The word for salt here, it's different, okay? This isn't a huge doctrinal point, but it's just good it almost sounds like James doesn't know what he's talking about, okay? James does know what he's talking about. The word that's used here for salt is different than the word in verse 11 that's used for bitter. It's not the same word at all, okay? And so when he says out of the same fountain can't come these two sorts of waters, this is almost like an unrelated example that he's given. The word that's used here isn't used anywhere else in the Bible. It's only used here, but it's used commonly in classical Greek, and it's a word that references the Dead Sea or the Salty Sea. And so it's very possible that what James is actually saying is, nor can the Salty Sea produce fresh water, okay? Of course, if you know anything about the Dead Sea, it's dead. Yeah, why is it dead? Yeah, it doesn't go, it takes in, it doesn't take out, but the water is so salty. They say that every now and then a fish will find its way down into it and just die. It dries up and it's pretty. Anyway, you can look up some information about that. But they would have all been very aware of how the Dead Sea would work and just the fact that it doesn't produce any life there at all, right? And so it doesn't produce anything fresh, anything good. Okay. Moving on. Any questions there before we go on? Are we good? Okay. Verse 13. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds and the gentleness of wisdom. It's important not to lose context, okay? Because it kind of sounds like James is shifting gears, but he's really not. The context that we started with in this chapter is this: let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. And then he spent, several verses there talking about the importance of, again, the consistency of our faith in our actions, our faith in our speech, all of those sorts of issues coming out there. And so what James is warning us is that not everybody who wants to teach is fit to do it, right? Certainly there's a call here to take this responsibility very, very seriously. Requires self-control, self-discipline, spiritual discipline for sure. And what he's doing is James is now he's been challenging the authenticity of the faith we claim, right? And what we're looking for is consistency in our belief, our doctrine, and our character. That's what we're after. And so how we talk to God, or talk about God, and how we talk to man, we should see some consistencies in that. And so here, two words that we want to pay attention to: wise and understanding. Okay, the word wise in the Greek it's a pretty typical word for wisdom. And we've talked about that in chapter 1. It's practical application of knowledge, right? So wisdom is not how smart you are. Wisdom is knowing what to do with the smarts you have. Okay, that's what it is. Me and the boys, we go through the book of Proverbs a lot, and several years ago, it's hard to do Bible study with young kids because you have to explain things at a level that they're going to understand. But then, it's like if you can do that, that's pretty good. You know what I mean? Because it's helpful to do that for adults too. It's like I've learned a lot by trying to explain things to little kids. Okay, and so trying to explain wisdom to them. I always said wisdom is learning how to make good decisions. Is making a good decision. I think that's a pretty accurate way of looking at that. So wisdom is not just I read the book. It's I've used it. I've put this to practice. I've got some real life experience. It's common sense is kind of what we would call wisdom today. And so who's wise, right? It's practical application. So it's not just, again, I've got the book smarts. I've studied up. It's not that. It's who's put this to practice. Who's got some experience underneath their belt here. When it comes to this. And then understanding, okay, the Greek word there, it's not found anywhere else in the Bible, but it was, again, another one that's common in classical Greek. It meant someone who had special training. Okay, it's someone who is skilled. It's someone who's been, actually taken aside and taught how to do something. And so this is someone who expresses the knowledge, right, but from prolonged study. And so he's putting those two principles together. You need the information and you need to know how to use it, right? Wise and understanding. Wise and knowledgeable almost might be one way to look at that. But this word was also used to just describe a teacher. Someone who has been trained and is properly fit to teach. So you could say, well, who's the wise teacher? Might be another way to put that forth. So anyway, here's the challenge, right? Who among you is the wise teacher? Who among you is wise and understanding? Okay, that's the question. Who really is the wise and skillful teacher? Who among you is actually qualified to do this? We get the impression that, there was apparently a lot of people that were wanting to be teachers. And we've talked about the source of that desire already, and we spent some time in that. But James is not implying that nobody is fit to teach. Right? This isn't one of those rhetorical questions where the answer is, I guess nobody is. He's actually just calling us to do a little bit of self-evaluation here, right? To take these matters to heart, examine ourselves. Am I really fit to do this? And of course, if the answer is no, that doesn't mean, I guess I can't ever teach. If the answer is, maybe I'm not fit to do this, the solution is get fit to do this. Take it seriously. Put in the work. You know what I mean? Do the study. Put it into practice. Live it out and help people. Right? That's what we want. We need teachers. This isn't a call to say, maybe nobody should be teaching. Maybe we only just need one teacher anywhere. It's not that. It's that we have to take it very seriously. So this is a call to examine yourself. Obviously, like I said, a lot of people claim that they were ready to teach. James is saying, good enough. Prove it. If you're wise and understanding, if you're able to get up and teach, prove it. And so how do we prove it? Well, let him show by his good behavior, his deeds, and the gentleness of wisdom. And so the wisdom of man will be demonstrated in his behavior. In other words, wisdom's proven by conduct. Or you'll know them by their fruit, guys. It's the same principle we've been hitting this whole chapter. And so, okay, good behavior. Let's look at that word good. It's sometimes translated attractive. Okay, and I think the idea there is, of course, it means to be valuable or worthy, but it means it's not offensive. right? There's a high standard behind it. People are drawn to it. That's the idea. It's a good thing, right? It's a good thing. And so it's non-offensive, it's valuable, it's worthy, that's so that's the behavior we're looking for. And the word behavior is interesting because I think the King James Version translate this conversation. Okay, and so I've actually seen this taught, and I understand why, where someone says, well, let them prove that they're ready to teach by their good conversation. In other words, let them prove they're ready to teach by their speech. You could see how easy that is to apply that to chapter 3, talking about the tongue. Okay, and so and that's not a wrong way to apply it, but the word conversation doesn't mean today what it used to mean. Okay, words change, and this is good to know. I had back when I was in school, every class I took was a Bible class, in Bible college, and then we had Greek, and I had we had an English teacher from Moorhead come in once a week to make sure that we could speak and write. Okay, so that was the only class that we had that wasn't, a proper Bible class. We had an English teacher, and he didn't even have we didn't have tests or anything. He basically just came in to help us understand some things and work through, just to make sure we could speak and talk and whatever. So, but anyway, one of the things he brought up, and I never forgot this, is that he said dictionaries don't tell you what words mean. They tell you how words are used. And I think about that all the time. A dictionary doesn't tell you what a word means. It tells you how words are used. And you know that. We know that because dictionaries change, don't they? Every year we'll hear someone say, hey, did you hear they've added this word to the dictionary, or they've changed the definition of this word? And, if you've been around, more than 10 years, you've probably can think to yourself, man, back when I was a kid, this word meant something different. So even in your lifetime, you've seen words change. I've seen words change. And so if you get a dictionary for 2025, there's going to be words in there, and it's going to tell you, the definition of the word, but it's just telling you how that word is used in 2025. That doesn't mean that's what the word means. It just means that's how the word's being used. Here's what's important about that. If you take a modern dictionary and look up the word baptism, what are you going to find? You're going to find however the world is using that word right now, which is not biblical and not true, right? But it is true that people are using that word that way. You're going to find sprinkle, pouring, all sorts of things. It's crazy. If you look at a modern, and there's other words like that, but that's why we kind of want to stay away from dictionaries to define biblical words. You want to go back and look at the original Greek word. How was that word being used in the time of the Bible? And so that's important to know. There is a Bible. Have anyone here ever gotten to the 1828 Webster Dictionary? Okay, a couple of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so there's the 1828 dictionary. Webster actually worked alongside a lot of the Restoration guys to put that thing together. And so the definitions in that dictionary are pretty biblical. And most of them are actually, the definitions come from the Bible, and you'll find scriptures all over that dictionary. I mean, that's how he defines most of the words, or using that. And so if you can get a hold of one of those, you can get one online for free. There's an 1828 dictionary. You can go right there online. It's for free. I got one at home, and it's everyone's like, oh, it's thrilling to go through the dictionary. It is. But I like to, just how words, if you look up man, just man, in a modern dictionary today, it has to do with your biology. That's all it is. You look up man in the 1828 dictionary, it has to do with honor, character, those sorts of things. And so just how things have changed over time. And so anyway, I say that because conversation today means I had a conversation with Jake. We sat down and we spoke. It's how I spoke. But at one time, the word conversation was your entire makeup. It was who you are. It's your whole character is what that word meant, right? And so I put the 1828 definition of the word conversation up here. General course of manners, behavior, deportment, especially as it respects to morals. And so when the King James, for example, translates this, show by your good conversation, that's not at all a bad or wrong translation of that word. It's just we see conversation, we think speech. It's way broader. Now, is speech part of it? Absolutely it is, right? And behavior, that's it too, but it's deeper than that. It's your whole makeup. It's the source of why you do what you do, right? Which is what James has been driving at this entire time. And so what James is saying is, okay, you think you're a wise and skilled teacher? Prove it by your conduct, by your character, by your life, by your deeds, by your speech, by your morals. That's where you prove that you're fit to teach. Okay, that's the idea. And so he also brings up, your good behavior or character, your good conversation, but also his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. Okay, gentleness and meekness. Some translations will use meekness. It's not weakness like that. It's strength it's under control. That's what that word means. And so it's humility, but it's also, when we talk about Christian meekness, it's voluntary surrender to Christ. That's what that is. It's that I am willfully putting myself into submission to Jesus Christ and the authority of his word. And so that's what that's talking about. And then the wisdom, he says, in this gentleness of wisdom, it's the same wisdom that we're called to pray for in chapter 1, right? If any of you lacks wisdom, what are we supposed to do? Let him ask of God, right? And so let him show by his good behavior and his deeds in the gentleness of this wisdom that he's received from God, right? From asking for it. And what James is talking about is Christian maturity. Again, we can't get around that. Like it just keeps coming back to that idea. Good character demonstrated by our deeds and humility and wisdom. He's saying these are qualities that make an individual wise and skilled to teach, fit for the job. Guys, teachers don't just deal with information, they deal with people. Okay? They don't just deal with information, teachers deal with people. And so we have to take information, we also have to relate it to people. We have to be able to get it to people in a relatable way, right? We have to try to change people's mind with that information. We need to encourage movement in the people that we talk to. We call individuals to repent. We call people, when you're trying to teach somebody, whether it's a Christian we're trying to get to grow and build up, or whether it's a lost person we're getting one-on-one with, we are essentially calling them to uproot their entire way of life and thinking, and to bring that under submission to Jesus Christ in the Word. That's a huge undertaking, guys, to deny yourself, to pick up your cross daily, to follow. That's a huge undertaking. We're dealing with people's lives here, their very lives, and it's important that we can relate these things in a skilled way, but we're also demonstrating that we have put these practices into our own life as well. And so he's saying these are the things that makes one fit. Real quick before we take our break, Galatians 6:1, he says, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted." Now, this isn't talking about teachers. This is talking about every Christian. This is a responsibility that every Christian ought to take hold of here. But teachers specifically are going to be in this situation a lot, right? Where we have an opportunity to do exactly this, to call a congregation or to call an individual to restore them, right? And that's the idea. And so if we're going to do that, it has to be done with gentleness, self-control, right? That's the idea. And so we're going to have to rely on this wisdom that we have. And so anyway, the principle here then is, how do you become a wise and understanding teacher? By studying and practicing the Word of God. Sound familiar? Sounds like what James has been teaching since chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 5 verse 14 says, "Solid foods for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil." Okay, and so maturity comes from putting things into practice. Okay, that's how you get experience, right? Everybody that does something for the first time is bad at it, right? That's the entrance fee, is that you've got to be willing to be bad at it to get started. And so by practice, you mature, you grow, you get better, you get skilled, right? And so, for a teacher, we got to put these things into practice, right? It's going to take practice. That's how you become mature. That, it takes training. Have their senses trained to discern good and evil, right? And so those things are required there. And so biblical wisdom comes from obedience to the Scriptures, okay? And so you don't measure biblical wisdom by how much somebody knows, but how much of it they're applying, okay? That's the principle. All right, let's take us a break, and we'll jump back in here in a few. Okay, so James is going to bring up two types of wisdom, in the next couple verses. So two types of wisdom, kind of like, it's very similar to the discussion we had in chapter 2 about the different kinds of faith. And so he's going to say that there's two types of wisdom. One comes from above, and one is worldly. And so in verses 14 through 16, he's going to describe the wrong kind of wisdom and the results that come with it. And then in verses 17 and 18, he's going to describe a godly or a spiritual wisdom, a wisdom from above, and he's going to talk about the results that come with it. Okay, and so that's where we're at here. So verse 14, he says, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant, and so lie against the truth. Okay, so again, James is calling us, who's the wise and skillful teacher? He's calling us all to look into our own heart and be honest with ourselves here. And guys, we're the hardest people to see. Like, you can see your neighbor, you can see the people sitting next to you, we can all see the preacher and the teacher and when he's standing up front, but to look at yourself, you are the hardest person to see. And so James is trying to get us to evaluate, are these qualities there? Like, are they in your heart or not, right? And so you need to pay attention. So let's kind of walk through this. Bitter jealousy. The word there is zealous. It's the word for zeal, okay? Jealousy, it's the word that we get for zeal. It's translated jealousy in places as well, but it means to have an excitement of mind or a fervor of spirit. Okay, and so the thing about zeal is zeal by itself is pretty neutral. Not necessarily good, not necessarily bad. There's certainly we need to have a zeal for the right things, right? If we're not excited about the Lord, why would anybody else be? If you're not excited about Bible study, nobody else is going to be. If you're not excited about coming to church on Sunday and being a part of the congregation and being around the Lord's table, well, then why would anyone else be? And as a parent, if all you do is grumble and complain about the assembly, don't be surprised when your kids want nothing to do with it when they're older. You know what I mean? You need to be excited about what you're doing with the Lord. That needs to be demonstrated to people. So zeal's good, but zeal can also be bad if it's aimed at the wrong thing. And that's the idea. The issue with zeal is what's motivating it and what is it aimed at. Okay, those are the issues. And so, for example, in John chapter 2 and verse 17, when Jesus is flipping the tables, there in the temple, the disciples saw that, right? And this verse came to mind. His disciples remember that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Right? And so not a bad thing, right? Jesus had a zeal, and it was aimed at the right things, and we see the results of that, even though people were highly offended by that. Zeal was what pushed him to do that. Okay? But also, like in Romans chapter 10 and verse 2, it speaks of a zeal that is not in accordance with knowledge. Right? He talks about, people who might be religious and zealous, right? They might have an excitement about it, but it's not in accordance with knowledge. And we know people like that. I mean, we know for sure people that aren't obeying the truth, but they may be sincere, they may be excited, they may sacrifice for what they think they believe. They are sold out to it. Doesn't make it right. Right? And so zeal by itself isn't going to get you very far. It's got to be aimed at the right thing, got to be motivated by the right thing. And so here James is saying that there is an envy that can be bitter. There's an envy that can be bitter, and that brings back that image of the fountain that brings forth bitter or fresh water, right? It's the same word that we saw in verse, was it 11? Whatever the verse that talks about the spring of water, the fountain. So it's the same word, right? So he's directly relating this. He's saying, okay, there can be an envy that brings forth this bitterness, right? It can bring forth a resentment. It can bring forth, something kind of ugly. And so Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15 says this, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. Okay? And so bitterness and resentment, guys, big concern for Christians. Okay? Christian people tend to be trying to do the right thing. We tend to be agreeable a lot of times. We want to help people out, those sorts of things. There's a tendency, though, for us to almost become a doormat for people. right? And think that we're helping them in doing that, right? So we'll let people walk on us. We won't stand our ground on certain things, and maybe we think where that's turning the other cheek. That's a different sermon that we should probably talk about sometime. But what that can lead to is a resentment or a bitterness. Sometimes it can look like, if somebody's wrong, I just want to be right. I don't really want to help them be right. I just want to prove them wrong, and so you could be zealous about that argument and not really trying to help anybody, and there's some bitterness tied up into that, and it's ugly. It comes from an ugly place. And so he's saying there's a zeal that is bitter. Okay. He also says that there's this selfish ambition. Okay, and it's interesting. There's some history to this word, which is why I put it up there. It's translated right. There's nothing wrong with the translation. It can be translated strife in a lot of places in your Bible, or selfish ambition. Okay, but the history of this is originally this word referred to somebody that worked for hire. Nothing wrong with that. If I say, hey, can I have a job? If you're going to pay me to mow your grass or work on your farm or build whatever it is, like you hire me for the job, that's what this word meant. And so it wasn't good or bad. It just meant someone that took a job for pay, right? You hired them out. This was a hired worker. Over time, that word began to mean different things. And so it became a word that referred to any work that someone would hire themselves out to, simply for just what I can get out of it. So principles aren't involved now, right? Doesn't matter if this is questionable morally, right? I'm only in it for what I can get out of it. Okay, and so that's where that word kind of pushed for a little further. Then later, that word became used to reference crooked politicians who would hire or bribe or pay people off to gain support, right? And so these were the people that they would pay. In other words, if they would pay me off for my support, I'm not loyal to them. I'm loyal to the dollar, right? And so they can have my support if they pay, So it became a word that to talk about that person that took the money, right? And is loyal to the money. That's the idea. And so after that, that's when this word became selfish ambition, right? It's almost synonymous with that idea of the end justifies the means, which we've talked about, has no business in the church. That is as worldly and as evil as a concept as there is. And a lot of the problems in our culture, politically, economically, it stems from that problem right there. Instead of holding to principles, let's just the end justify the means. No room for that spiritually in our lives. And so this word is someone that would go to any extreme to accomplish an agenda, regardless of morally, whether it's questionable or not, or those sorts of things. And so selfish ambition. Okay, so there's a wisdom that comes from this. Okay, there's a shrewdness that comes from this. Okay, you can be wise in how you accomplish your goal. That doesn't mean you're spiritual in how you're accomplishing your goal, right? You can have a wisdom that produces a zeal, a confidence, an excitement, but it stems from bitterness. It's a bitter zeal. It's a resentment almost. And so what we're talking about, guys, is motives. We're talking about impure motives, right? A wisdom that stems from impure motives. And so James is calling every Christian, examine the motives behind your labor in the kingdom of God. Maybe not teaching, whatever it is that you do for the Lord, examine your motives. Where's that coming from? Right? Is it coming from resentment? Is there bitterness in there? Is it selfishness? Right? Is this about the Lord? Is this about the kingdom? Is this about serving, helping, edifying, and building up? Or is this about you? Is this about your ego? Right? Is this about your reputation? Is this about your influence? Okay? And we're fools if we think that doesn't happen. Okay, we're fools if we think that doesn't happen in the church. But we have to remember, the church is a body, right? The church is a body. We grow together. We hurt together, right? We rejoice together. We suffer together. And that doesn't work if we come into that with selfish ambition or self-centeredness. Personal pride violates the glory of God every time. Couple scriptures just to reinforce this. 2 Peter 2:2-3. Many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of the truth will be maligned. And in their greed, they'll exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle. Their destruction is not sleep. So again, what's the issue here? It's motive, isn't it? right? It's motive. At the end justifies the means, whatever they've got to do to push themselves up, and push you down in the process, doesn't matter, right? So they'll exploit you with false words. In their greed, they'll do that. That's the motivation. Truth's going to be maligned. Jude says this in verse 16. They're grumblers, finding fault, following after their own lusts. So we see the motive. Then they speak arrogantly, flattering people for what? Sake of gaining an advantage. They're going to tell you what you want to hear because that'll get you to follow them. That increases their popularity. That's what that's about. Okay. Philippians chapter 1, 15 through 17, Paul says, some to be sure are preaching Christ, even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. You think that's isolated to just Paul's day? There are those even today that will preach the gospel out of selfish ambition, not out of a love for the Lord and a love for people. Okay? And so we have to check our motives. James calling us to take a close look at our own hearts here. Okay? The problem with bitter zeal and selfish ambition is they aren't worn on the outside. Right? They are concealed in the heart. That's the issue. The heart's the base of operation here. It sets everything else in motion. Right? So our tongue, our behavior is just going to reveal what's already going on in the heart, which we've been talking about that. But that's the issue, okay? And then, so James says, okay, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, he says, do not be arrogant, and so lie against the truth. So, again, calling us to examine the heart, are these qualities there? Bitter zeal, selfish ambition, check your motives, okay? And then we're warned, don't be so arrogant as to lie against the truth. Okay, the idea of arrogance is to exalt yourself. So we see a position there again, right? Don't exalt yourself and then lie against the truth. Some individuals do not want to lead, work alongside, or help others. They just want to triumph over them, right? And that's not how the church works. Sometimes you see congregations that are going pretty good, but you can tell it's a one-man show. You know what I mean? Just a one-man show. Take that guy out of the picture, and what happens? The whole place just falls apart. That's not how this is supposed to work, guys. We're supposed to work alongside each other. I want you to grow. I want to grow. I want our congregation in Glencoe, I want them to grow. I don't want that's the idea. So it's not about triumphing over. It's about, hey, let's all move forward together. Okay, and so Jesus, of course, brings this up. Mark 10, 42 through 45, calling them to himself. Jesus said, well, you know that those who are recognized as rulers, so that's the idea, right? In the world, those that want to be rulers, those who are recognized as wise and skilled teachers, for example, it says that they lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. Verse 43, it is not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life a ransom for many. So, again, here's the point. A good and skillful teacher is a servant, right? Leading by example, helping others. There's a wisdom from God that's going to be seen in his life, and selfishness and self-centeredness and that bitter zeal, it's not going to be part of that, right? And so, that kind of life is inconsistent with the faith that we're supposed to complain. And so your life, if you're living it like that, is a contradiction to the very thing you're trying to teach. So your deeds, just like your heart or just like your tongue, will betray your heart. And so these individuals as teachers, again, that's the whole premise. Who among you is the wise and skillful teacher? Let's prove it, right? These individuals are unfaithful to the truths they pretend to believe, teach, and maybe even defend. I want you to think about this. I used to do this at our congregation in Glencoe, especially when we're just trying to deal with basic doctrine, right? So you have to establish how is doctrine established. And so one of the things I got a sheet of paper I handed out to everybody, and I said every practice that happens in the church, every practice that you do, like everything involved with your faith and Christianity in the church, like it can fall into one of three categories. Right? There's scriptural things. There's anti-scriptural things. And then there's unscriptural things, which, doesn't mean bad, just means it's not in there, right? And so sometimes we do things, and it's like, well, it's not good or bad. It's just, you're not going to find a biblical defense for it. Okay? We take the Lord's Supper between the music and the sermon. Most people do. There's no biblical call for that. We are to take it on the Lord's Day, but you can move it around. You know what I mean? You can put it at the end, of the beginning, however you want. You know what I'm saying? So there's things that we do that are practiced that are just, doesn't matter. But then there's some things sometimes people do that are against what the Bible says, and some things, of course, that we want to be in accordance with the Scripture. Now, trying to determine what is scriptural, okay, that's what's important, is we need to figure out what are scriptural doctrines. A couple ways we see that. Easy way is if we have a pretty blatant Scripture that says do this, right? We could say there's our doctrine right there. We see it black and white, sometimes red, boom. Thus saith the Lord, we know what to do. Sometimes it's not said, it's demonstrated. So for example, we don't have a verse of Scripture that plainly says on the first day of the week, take the Lord's Supper. We have it demonstrated in Acts 20, verse 7, that's what the church did. That's the practice the church did, and so that's where our doctrine comes from, right? And so sometimes doctrine is not stated as much as it's demonstrated in the Scriptures. You all following me? Okay, when it comes to false teaching, we really only talk about false teaching as things that are being said, right? Well, this guy's teaching false doctrine. That's a false plan of salvation. We talk about false doctrine like false doctrine is plainly stated. But just like sound doctrine, false doctrine can also be demonstrated. And this is the area that we need to pay a little closer attention to, because what's the chance that maybe I wouldn't get up and preach false doctrine, but if someone was watching my life, they might see inconsistencies. You see what I mean? So false doctrine doesn't have to be proclaimed. It can be demonstrated, just like sound doctrine can be demonstrated. And so we got to watch those things. So James says, hey, do not be arrogant and lie against the truth. Okay, and so I'm just saying we can lie against truth and lie against sound doctrine, not just in our speech, but in our behavior, right? In our behavior. And so we got to pay attention to that. And so that's the call. Again, examine our heart, examine where this is coming from. Okay, so verse 15, he says this wisdom, the one that we just described, that has selfish ambition, that has got a bitter resentment to, or bitter zeal to it, that wisdom, he says, is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. Okay? And so the wisdom that is accompanied with bitter zeal, selfish ambition, arrogance, lying against the truth, it lacks compassion, it lacks humility, that wisdom has a source. It doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from the Bible. It doesn't come from studying the Bible. It doesn't come from putting the Bible into practice. It doesn't come, it has a source, but the source isn't good. It's not the fruit of living by faith. It's not the fruit of following Scripture. It's not the wisdom, certainly not the wisdom that we're called to pray for in James 1:6 or 1:5. So where does this wisdom come from? James says it's earthly, it's natural, and it's demonic. Earthly wisdom means it's worldly. Its source is right out here in the world, right? It's the wisdom that we acquire by walking in the flesh, by living a life in the world and amongst the world. That's that wisdom, guys. It's the wisdom that if you aren't diligent in making specific intentional efforts, it's the wisdom you're living by, right? And so people with this wisdom, they're rooted in worldly principles, worldly standards, worldly gain. It accomplishes worldly goals, it uses worldly methods, and it measures success by worldly standards. Now, certainly we wouldn't see any of that in the church, though, right? We do, don't we? Yeah, and that's the shame, as we take that wisdom and we apply it to the church and we say we should set the church up like the world. We should run the church like the world. We should measure success in the church like the world would, and it's totally backward, right? And so there is a wisdom to it, right? I mean, there's books. Guys, you could spend a fortune on books that'll tell you how to run the church like a business, how to set the leadership up like a CEO in some corporate meetings, and they'll tell you how to grow the church the way you would grow a business, how to market the church the way you would market a product. There's a lot of wisdom that goes into all that. It's garbage. It's not biblical. It's not from God, but it's wisdom nonetheless. They're putting thought into it. They've got experience. These people that can get a church, and fill it up with, they know how to do it. You know what I mean? They've got wisdom in that. They've got experience in that. It's just not biblical, right? It's not a biblical approach. And so, again, it works well, if you're competing with worldly things. You want to use it to climb the corporate ladder or campaign for somebody's favor. If you want to keep up with the Joneses and impress your neighbors, this wisdom will get you there. Okay? He also says that wisdom is natural. And, natural, I think we have a hard time defining and translating that word a little bit, but it's found a couple places. It's found about 4 different times in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 2:14 brings it up here. He says, a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. They are foolishness to him, for he cannot understand them because they're spiritually appraised. Okay, and what this verse does, it doesn't say that the natural man can't understand it. It says the natural man's not going to understand it because spiritual things are spiritually appraised. And what does it mean to appraise? To assign a value to it, right? And so the point is, the world finds no value, again, in what we're doing tonight, right? So they don't understand what we're doing because they see that we're wasting our time tonight. You could be doing 1,000 other things. This is so the natural man, this is wasting your time. You support ministries. You put money in the offering plate on a Sunday. A worldly man thinks that is the dumbest thing you could do. You're just throwing money away. They don't get it. Right? Because they don't understand it. It's not important to them. Right? And so these things are spiritually appraised. They're not worldly appraised. And so the natural world, one way to look at this is like, listen, it's natural to take the path of least resistance. We just had flood. We had water come out of our ears there. We had Jeremy on an island. Milton was flooded. That water goes away. It takes the path of least resistance. It's going to go downhill the fastest way it can, and so that's what nature does. It takes the easiest way out. That the body naturally prefers to rest than work. If you don't make any effort, you're not going to get up and do anything. Okay, if you don't interfere with your garden, anyone planting a garden yet? Good, I'm not behind. Okay, you all got me mowing, and you know what I got to do this week? Got to mow again. I told you once you start. Randy, did you hold out? See, you're in that same boat. I feel you. Oh, okay. You can't help it now. People can see it. Yeah. So, you got a garden and you just let it grow naturally and don't interfere with it. What are you going to have? Yeah, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be worthless, right? And so my point is, it's natural to do what's easy, right? It's natural to do what's easy over what's hard. And so that sort of wisdom appeals to the worldly. Yeah, why would I do that when I could do nothing? Why would I work if I can get everybody else to take care of me? Why would I put in the effort if you'll do it instead? That's a natural wisdom. And so Jude kind of doesn't specifically. I don't have it up there. Jude 1:10 talks about those who the things they know by instinct, like unreasoning animals. By those things they're destroyed. That's what I think of when I think of this natural man. They're running on like an animal instinct, right? And it's that very thing that will destroy them. But they're not putting in any effort. They're just letting, whatever, just naturally, this feels right, this feels good, this is easy for today. There's a wisdom to it, not good though. Okay, and then demonic. He says this sort of wisdom is demonic. It has its influence, guys. The Bible speaks of a demonic teaching, demonic doctrine, talks about deceitful spirits. 1 Timothy 4:1, the Spirit explicitly says, in later times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. Right? And so this is a wisdom that has its influence by the demons. James brought up a faith that man and demon can share, right? Even demons believe and shudder. He brings up a wisdom that man and demons can share, right? It's demonic. But I also want you to notice here the digression. Earthly, natural, demonic. Each step puts you more alienated from God as it goes, right? It gets further and further away from God's wisdom. And so that's where it's going. The further you go, the further from where you need to be. And so in verse 16, he says this, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is discord and every evil thing. So this is the outcome of living by a worldly wisdom, right? This is what it is. Human wisdom, wisdom from below, wisdom that's earthly and natural and demonic. This is what it gets us. Okay, he uses the same words here that we used in verse 14, jealousy and selfish ambition, right? Showing that there's a connection here. And so where these things exist, this sort of wisdom, what we get is disorder and every evil thing. Okay, the word disorder, it's made up of 3 words really, but if you take the A off of it, just the katastasia, I don't know, sounds like a nut. Pistachio. I don't know. Anyway, if you take the A off, this is the word for order, right? So the A means like, A is like putting, it's unorder, I guess, or disorder. It's the, so there's 3 words that make this up. The word that means order means downstanding. In other words, it's this idea that things are in place. You know what I mean? State of being in a settled condition. Things are settled down. And so the no in the front means that this is a state of unrest. Right? Things aren't settled, right? Things are chaotic. Things are a mess. Things are, in a state of disorder and instability. And the word was often used specifically about political disarray, right? And political rebellion and revolt and that sort of a thing. And so I think James is alluding to this idea that in one way or another, this sort of wisdom will create a rebellion against God's authority. Right, against the kingdom of God itself, right? And so, and you're going to see this, guys, in somebody's life. You're going to see this in congregations where this sort of wisdom exists. There's a church, in a church, where this wisdom exists in a church, you see a church that's rebelling against God's order and against God's authority, right? Selfish ambition, arrogance, bitter resentment, lying to the truth. All this is going to create is disorder and disarray. And James used the same word to describe the double-minded man in James 1:8, who was unstable in all his ways, right? And so it's the same idea. And so that's what this creates. But it also creates every evil thing, which would include every evil thing. That's, this wisdom will produce every sort of evil that exists in the world. That's the idea. And so this wisdom that's earthly and natural and demonic, it amplifies sin, it encourages sin, it justifies sin, and it creates opportunity for sin, right? And so again, you work this backward, okay? If we work this backward and we say, okay, if you see a congregation where there's just disorder and every evil thing going on among the church, well, what you're going to find at the heart of that church is jealousy and selfish ambition. That's it. And that is a foundation. You see that in a family. You see that in a marriage. You see it in a workplace. If you see disorder and every evil thing, what you're going to find at the heart of that is that the devil will use selfish ambition and bitter jealousy as a launch pad to create that sort of disorder, chaos, and every evil thing. That's where this stuff is going to start. Again, you're going to see it in your life. You're going to see it in your church. You're going to see it in your marriage. You're going to see it among your family. That's the idea.